All right. So this is a session about search. We have two amazing papers. I'm going to start introducing Leon, and then I'll come back to introduce Ananya. Leon Musolf is going to be our first presenter. He's an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Business, in the Business Economics and Public Policy group. Before he was local to me, he was in Boston at Microsoft Research. And before then, he did a PhD at Princeton. His research is actually very exciting about digital platforms and all the strategies that they can use to nudge consumers to make choices. And his paper today is really one of these examples. And he's going to present sources of market power in web search, evidence from a field experiment. Thank you, Leon.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about sources of market power in web search. And this project is joint work with various excellent people, one of whom is in the room. Hunt, where are you? Raise a hand. Anyhow, somewhere in this room. All right, over there. Perfect. Excellent. All right, so let's get started. I think given the audience in this room, I don't need to remind anyone that Google dominates web search, right? Increasing super high market share. And, you know, of course, we all know there's been some recent antitrust attention paid to Google because of this, amongst other things, because Google pays, you know, maybe around $26 billion or more in annual payments to remain the default search engine on various browsers and phones. So against this backdrop, we want to ask and answer two key research questions. The first one is, why is Google's market share so high? It could, of course, be that Google is simply the better search engine. Even then, is Google simply the better search engine because it sees more user data? Is a relevant question. It could also be that people simply think Google is the better search engine because they never try any of the competitors. And then finally, you know, with figures such as $26 billion floating around, you might wonder whether default effects play a large role in shaping market outcomes, perhaps because there's switching costs or users are inattentive. And then the second research question we want to ask and answer today is, what would be the effects of various levels of competition policy in affecting the outcomes on the web search market? So you could think of active choice screens like in the European Union. You could think of changing defaults, making Bing the default everywhere, for instance, or you could think about requiring Google to share data with its competitors. And the challenge to me is that we do this in this paper by developing a model, then using it to inspire us to design and run a field experiment, combining that with observational click and query data to then run some counterfactuals. And I have OC 22 minutes. So let's see how far we get. All right, I'm going to skip the literature having said that, and we're going to go straight into the demand model. Now, next 3 slides, some Greek letters, not so much after that. So what we do in this demand model is we really want to think, how do consumers choose between certain search engines, you know, and we want to help that structure our thinking. So how does a consumer choose between search engines? Well, with my apologies to some in the room, we're going to limit attention to Google and Bing because all other market shares are really a rounding error on desktop web search. And we're going to say, you know, there's some true flow utility according to which you choose. We're just going to decompose that into quality. Quality measures, you know, search result relevance, all that stuff. There's going to be payments because we're going to have a field experiment. And then there's going to be some idiosyncratic preferences. Some people just really like one search engine or the other search engine. And the thing that's important for us today is that that's going to be time invariant so that we don't have to deal with sort of changing preferences over the course of the experiment. And the experiment is relatively quick. So that's quite plausible, I think. Now, one key thing we want to emphasize is that search engines are experience goods. And by that, I mean, what you believe about how good a search engine is not necessarily correct. We're going to assume it's correct if you have experienced that search engine. But if you've never experienced it, we're going to allow for your belief to be wrong. I'm not imposing that your belief is wrong. To be clear, we're going to estimate whether you believe different things before and after experiencing a search engine. And that's just going to sort of come into that utility equation because you're going to make your decisions based on your perceived utility, not based on your true utility. Then the final important thing we have in this model is inertia. So the idea is that you actually are born with a default search engine, right? When you open your browser for the first time, that browser has a default search engine. If it's Google, for instance, sorry, if your browser is Chrome, for instance, your default search engine is Google. On Edge, it's Bing. So we're going to say that defaults are going to influence choices via two inertia channels. The first one is inattention. We just don't wake up every morning thinking about what search engines we should choose, right? We're going to allow some people to be permanently inattentive and others every now and then make a choice. And we're going to estimate how much of each type there are. And then there's also going to be a switching cost. It's just costly. You have to go through the various menus and so on. That's also going to be in our model. And then that's also going to go into that utility equation for your choice. All right, why did I walk you through all of these Greek letters? Well, really just so I can get to this slide, because our demand model tells us that there are 4 reasons that I already previewed before why Google's market share could be high in equilibrium. It could be that the true quality of Google is high. It could be that there are quality misperceptions. It could be that there are switching costs, or it could be that users are frequently inattentive. How are we going to tell these 4 sources of market power apart? Well, that's what we ran an experiment for. What's this experiment we ran? Well, recruited around 2,400 people on Prolific last year in March. I can't believe it's almost already been a year. And our sample was sort of US adults browsing on a desktop computer using Edge or Chrome, reporting that they usually use Google or Bing. And on that intake survey one, we collected some demographics, asked them their opinions about search engines, all pretty standard stuff. And then we had them install our amazing browser extension that is creatively named Search Extension. Right? I will never get hired in a marketing department. All right, so what does Search Extension do? Well, it records every time a search engine is used, starting, and this is important, 20 days before the initial intake survey. How can we do that? We can use your browsing history, right? So we know what search engine you're using during the experiment, after the experiment, and before the experiment. All right, then we have various treatments on survey one that I'm going to get to in a second, and then eventually it's going to be sort of a second survey. So what are these treatments? Well, of course, some people are just going to be control users, right? We show them how to change their bookmarks, nothing important there. Then we have the active choice treatment. These people, we say, you have to go to that menu where you choose which search engine you want, and you have to choose whatever search engine you want. And we verify that they actually made it to that menu. So we ask them for have them implement their preferred default search engine. There is also a switch bonus group. These people, we pay some money to try something else. If they were using Bing before, we pay them money to use Google. If they were using Google before, we pay them money to use Bing. And after 14 days, that group also will have to make an active choice, at that point, having had the experience of both search engines. That's crucial. And then finally, there's the default change group. We pay them some money to change their default, and then we never contact them again. The idea is that's going to help us figure out, how attentive people are. So this is the details of the experimental design. Right, we have that day 0 intake survey, randomization to the various treatment groups, and then on day 14, there is this follow-up survey. And what I haven't told you about yet so far is that some people in the switch bonus group, these are people who are trying Bing for the first time, we're actually not going to give them real Bing. We're going to sort of change Bing a little bit. We can block ads, or we can make the search results worse. Let's see if we get to the results on that. All right, so how does that model help us, or how does that experiment help us identify these potential sources of market power in web search? I'm going to use this graph to explain that. On a horizontal axis, you just see time. Each line is going to correspond to one of our treatment conditions. And on the vertical axis, you see Bing's market share amongst Chrome users. And this is not yet data. This is a stylized representation to help me explain how the data will inform us. So in the control group, of course, we'd expect no changes in market share over time. In the active choice group, we might expect that, when we have them make an active choice, the market share of Bing changes. If the market share of Bing increases a lot, for instance, that means there is a perceived quality difference between Bing and Google that is quite small, because now a lot of people are actually choosing Bing, right? If the market share of Bing is 50% and Google 50%, sounds like there's not a huge perceived quality difference. We can also compare the control group to the active choice group to get a sense of how much inertia is driving the market shares. Because the only difference between active choice and control is that active choice made, well, an active choice, right? It's in the name. So they're not subject to inattention. They're not subject to switching costs. So rather, they have to pay the switching costs anyhow, no matter what search engine they choose. Then we have the switch bonus group. The first nice thing about the switch bonus group is that in this interim period, we are paying them money to use a different search engine, but they don't have to say yes. That means we're going to learn about how much they value one search engine relative to the other. We're going to learn about their price sensitivity. Now, after that incentive expires, on day 14, they make another active choice. What does that mean? That means on day 15, The only difference between switch bonus and active choice is that additional experience that switch bonus had with that other search engine, right? So for instance, these are Google users who've now experienced Bing for the first time and are making an active choice. And we're comparing them to Google users who've never experienced Bing and are making an active choice. The difference between these two groups is going to reveal what we call learning or misperceptions, initial misperceptions about quality. And then finally, there's the default change group that's going to tell us sort of about inattention in two ways. All right, so that is going to be how we identify things. Now let's look at some actual data, right? This was all stylized. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing in data. All right, so here are the market shares. Again, this is amongst Chrome users, the Bing market share in the various conditions, exactly like the plot before. Control, nothing much happened. Thank God for that. All right, what happened in the active choice group? No, if you're sitting in the back of the room, that's not a mistake. The active choice line just lies directly on top of the control line. Turns out when you ask people, which search engine do you want to use? They all say, well, definitely Google, right? Now, that tells us two things. The first thing it tells us is there's a large perceived quality difference between Bing and Google. And the second thing it tells us that there's kind of like either a small switching cost or not a lot of inattention. We can't disambiguate between those two yet. Now, the next thing we do is we have the switch bonus group. Okay, so when we're paying people money to use Bing, then they are willing to use Bing, right? I guess that's good news for Microsoft headquarters. You know, the interesting thing is, of course, what happens on day 15 when the incentive expires and these people are making an active choice, an unincentivized active choice, now having experienced Bing. And you see the orange line stays above the active choice line. And that means that there are these quality misperceptions. People actually do value Bing more after they experience it. In fact, about a third of users that experience Bing stay with it after the incentive expires. And that third of users, we say, update positively about Bing. They either learn how to use Bing or they learn about Bing's quality. A little more on that in a second. Just before that, this is what happens in the default change group. Remember, these were people we paid to change their default to Bing on this plot for 2 days. And you see the Bing market share sort of slowly decaying after that as people stochastically become attentive over time. But the market share stays quite elevated, right? Suggesting that a bunch of people are permanently inattentive and will just never think about the search engine they choose again. All right, so a little more about this learning in the switch bonus group, because that may seem surprising to you. It was certainly of interest to us. And so we did a couple of things. The first one is we asked users for their relative preference for Bing relative to Google before they made the switch, which is on survey 1, right? So before they've experienced Bing, and then again on survey 2 after they experience Bing. And what we see is that the ratings all become more favorable towards Bing. So this is not just sort of an artifact of the choice data. It is also true that people after experiencing Bing think, actually, that wasn't so bad. We also had a survey where we surveyed stayers and just asked them, why did you stick with Bing? Free-form text response. And the responses are amazing. I've learned I overall enjoy Bing more. I learned I like the results I'm getting, or my personal favorite, I realized Bing was not as bad as I thought it was. If I had to summarize the paper in one line, I would block quote this survey respondent. And then finally, we also had a multiple choice aspect that basically confirmed that people seem to think that, they learned something here. All right, how are we doing? Oh, we're doing actually pretty all right on time. I can calm down a little bit. Okay, so what about the price response? So one thing we did in that switch bonus group is we paid users money to try out Bing, right? And a natural question you might have is, how much do you have to pay people to use Bing instead of Google? Because that reveals something about how strong people think their preferences are. Well, it turns out when you pay them nothing, you have a Bing market share in our sample of around 2%. If you pay them $1, and this is all for 2 weeks, by the way, I should have said. If you pay them $1 for 2 weeks, the Bing market share goes to 32%. At $10, it's 64%. And at $25, it's still only 74%. So there is about a quarter of people who value Google over Bing by more than $25 per 2 weeks, right? So multiply that by 50 weeks in a year. That's a lot of preference for Google. That's a strong preference for Google. Of course, this is the uninformed preference. The informed preference is going to be a little bit lower. And our model is going to sort of tell us how much lower the informed preference is. That is the preference after experiencing Bing. Before we get there, let me tell you about one more nifty thing our extension can do. So one thing our extension can do is it can give you a worse version of Bing. What do I mean by a worse version of Bing? Well, suppose you wanted to find Ariel Pecos's LinkedIn page, right? The economists in the room will have been through this. Everyone else, trust me, you want to be on Ariel Pecos's LinkedIn. All right? So you go, you search for it in the control group, right at the top. In the treatment group, not so much. What have I done? I have reordered the search results within page so that the first link is now number 10 and so on, right? The second link is number 8 and so on. So it really reduces the search result relevance a lot. You now have to scroll down to find what you are looking for. And the question is, of course, how did our experimental subjects react to that? And remember, these are subjects that hadn't yet seen Bing before. They were Google users at baseline and we're showing them this. They think this is what Bing is. So what happens? Well, they click a lot less. The organic click-through rate goes down by around 8 percentage points, or, you know, almost a 25% decline here. They also report that Bing is a lot worse. In fact, here what we do is we compare what they thought before to what they thought after experiencing Bing, and we compare that change for the people that we gave worse Bing to the change for the people who we gave original Bing. People who got original Bing, they all update positively about its quality. People who get worse Bing, they think, wow, this is about as bad as I thought it was. Finally, what happens to the market share? There we have a little less power, but also much weaker results. So it seems people notice this sort of lower quality result, but they don't actually react that much to the decreased quality of the result. So we're not entirely sure why they're not reacting, but it seems plausible to us that maybe there is actually just not that much quality response here. Certainly, I've updated a bit on thinking maybe users are less reactive to quality here than we initially thought. All right, this is the one moment where I lied earlier and I said no more Greek letters. This is the page with all the Greek letters, right? Because now, of course, I have to take all this data and I have to associate it with the Greek letters in the model. But I'm going to give you a couple of interpretations here just to give you sort of a sense for what the model says. The model says about 1/3 of users are permanently inattentive. So these are users that never make an active choice between the search engines. If they did make an active choice, then a Bing payment of around $3 every 2 weeks is going to equalize market shares. And if we got them to have correct perceptions, then the required payment would shrink to $2.80. And notice that these payments are a lot smaller than earlier. I said $25 every 2 weeks. Yes, but that's in the tail. There are some people in the tail who have extremely strong preferences, but if you are just like interested in market shares, getting market shares like 50% or something, most people have extremely weak preferences. All right, so with that, I want to get to the other side of the model. So far I've told you about a field experiment we ran that gives you some sense about how consumers choose between search engines. But of course, there is this sort of important thing lingering in the background, and that's returns to data. Returns to data is basically the following story. If you have more users, then you're going to generate more data, which is going to lead you to have a better ranking as a search engine, and a better ranking might attract more users, right? That last part we've already done because I've shown you what happens when we make the ranking worse. How does your market share change? We have estimated that. But that first part, we still have to do. So how are we going to relate, more user-generated data to a better search result ranking? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to say the quality of a search result ranking is just the organic click-through rate. So basically, do you click on a search result? And we're going to estimate how any given query's click-through rate increases with the number of impressions on that query. And we're going to integrate that over the query frequency distribution because the effect probably concentrates on the long tail. And this is the only part of the paper that we used internal Microsoft Bing data for. And maybe it's important to give a little bit of a disclaimer here. Microsoft did not fund the study. And the agreement with Microsoft is we can publish whatever we want, right? They have given us the data. We can't publish the data itself, but they have no right to review any of the findings here. And we get a random sample of around 44,000 new queries that we can then use to run this estimation. And basically, what we conclude after running the estimation here is that if Bing had access to Google's data, the click-through rate would increase from 23.5% to 24.8%. People disagree about whether this is a massive effect or a tiny effect. but that I can't tell you without also looking at the demand model, right? I just can tell you this is what data is worth. The other thing that's important here is the returns to data are they have diminishing returns. They're essentially logarithmic. And we find extremely strong support for this diminishing returns hypothesis. All right, now let me put it all together in the last 5 minutes with our counterfactuals. So the way I'm going to talk about the counterfactuals is I'm always going to be interested in Google's market share in the counterfactual, but also in consumer surplus in the counterfactual. And this is a little bit of a strange paper from an academic perspective, because regulators all seem to be very much on board with just reducing Google's market share. That seems to be like a strong goal. But the problem is, of course, we are only interested in reducing Google's market share if it actually helps the consumers. And so we always want to look at both of these numbers. So in our status quo, this has to do with our sample. In our sample, there's an 89% Google market share. Now, what we could do as a baseline is we can estimate what happens if we take away all the frictions, all the reasons that lead to sort of inefficient choices by consumers. And so we take away the switching cost, we take away inattention, we take away misperceptions, then you generate what you might think of as sort of the fair market share of Google, right? And that's around 74%. So that's a massive decrease, or rather, maybe it's a moderate decrease, but it would be a massive increase for Bing's market share, right? And that comes with a large consumer surplus gain. So we would love to be able to implement that. Regulators would love to be able to implement that. But the problem is, of course, it's not as easy as writing no frictions and passing it as a bill in Congress, right? That's not quite how the world works. So what can you implement? Well, one thing you could implement is a so-called choice screen, right? So a choice screen means that the first time you open a new device, the browser on a new device, it asks you, actually, before you do anything, can you just choose which search engine you want? That's a lot like our active choice intervention. And so what it does is it gets rid of switching costs and inattention, right? You might say it forces you to pay the switching costs, but either way, your choice is going to be efficient. But it keeps, and this is important, it keeps the misperceptions, right? So we saw earlier that everyone in the active choice treatment says, I love Google, I definitely want to stick with Google. And only after they've experienced some other search engine do they say, actually, wait, maybe the other search engine is okay too, right? So this doesn't happen here. So because of that, Google's market share stays almost unchanged. It declines by about 1 percentage point. That's pretty consistent with what Francesco and co-authors find happened in the European Union after the active choice screens were implemented in the European Union. So we're pretty happy that we matched that, but we're very unhappy with that as a regulatory tool. So what can you do? If you somehow could just correct perceptions, that would be great, right? The market share of Google would go down and consumer surplus would go up. Not as much as if you removed all frictions, of course, but that would be great. But how do you, as a regulator, get people to sort of have the correct perceptions? Well, one thing you could do, of course, is you could say, Bing default everywhere, right? So, of course, that wouldn't be formulated in this way. If you're a regulator, you would probably say, look, Google is not allowed to bid on default contracts, and Bing is allowed to bid on default contracts, and then this might or might not happen. If this were to happen, Google's market share would crater, yes, but also consumer surplus would really be lost. And notice the order of magnitude on these numbers, right? This is the only number, the only consumer surplus number that we have that is large. The really bad thing you can do here is default people into alternative search engines. That's a terrible idea. What can you do? Well, you could default people into alternative search engines and then 2 weeks later have the choice screen then. If you have this delayed choice screen, then people who hate this alternative search engine, they're still going to switch to Google once they are at the choice screen. But people who learned that actually this alternative search engine is not so bad, they're going to stick with the alternative search engine. And that is the one proposal that we have that's implementable. Thank you. That's implementable, that actually leaves consumer surplus more or less unchanged, very slightly raises it, and that reduces Google's market share. Now, all of the findings I've shown you so far actually didn't use this returns to data channel. Here we haven't endogenized yet the returns to data, right? This feedback between market share and data, and then quality, and then market share. Why have I done that? Well, the thing is, if I endogenize it, none of the conclusions change. So it turns out that according to our estimates, there is basically a very small feedback effect here. That's because we find consumers don't really care that much, and the data doesn't help that much. And so even if you do data sharing as an additional policy lever here, that's going to leave the market shares basically unchanged. And even if you sort of go at the outer edge of what's consistent with the data, it's basically still going to leave it unchanged. So with that, let me conclude. A couple of takeaways here. Defaults are extremely effective because about 1/3 of users are permanently inattentive. However, one key thing that defaults do is they prevent users from learning about other search engines. So defaults are not so much offensive as they are defensive for Google. How can regulators reduce Google's market share? Well, choice screens alone do not move the needle, but changing the default does. Still, that's not great when that's going to massively decrease consumer surplus. One way that might work is temporarily switching the default and then having a delayed choice screen. All in all, we don't find that economies of scale and data sharing are very important in this market, and that's because of the very fastly diminishing returns to scale. A couple of caveats. This was done with desktop users. The sample may not be representative. The returns to scale analysis is observational, and I'm sure people will bring up other caveats in the discussion. I look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Leon. Now Ananya Sen, he's an associate professor at the Heinz College at CMU. His research also focuses on platforms, specifically on media and education. And he has a long list of publications. I once heard a colleague say that Ananya has a monthly column at Management Science. He does have a lot of publications in Management Science, but not only there, Nature, PNAS. And today he's going to talk to us about something very related, trade-offs in leveraging external data capabilities, evidence from a field experiment in an online search market. All right, take it
away. Thank you, Chiara, for the introduction. Thank you for having me here. It's wonderful to see some really familiar faces, wonderful to see some new faces and get to know people. So I'm going to present something which is based on a field experiment with a collaborator that's anonymous and based on like the lunch conversations. Replicability is an issue because I can't make the data available. But the upside is that they were willing to let us publish this paper with minimal review. There was no their own press release or take on these results. So this was sort of our way of bringing out some issues related to the value of data and external data in particular to this conversation. And of course, Leon has really set the nice sort of foundation where he's talked about returns to data in an observational setting. We want to sort of try and build on that and focus on data sharing and actually run a field experiment to understand what the benefits or costs might be. This is joint work with Xiaoxia Lei, who's a PhD student at Shanghai Jiaotong University, and Yixing Chen, who's at the business school at University of Notre Dame. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about external data as a potential lever for product growth. So managers have been talking about it. Companies want access to different types of data so that they can incorporate it, learn about the users, tweak their products, so on and so forth. One of the ways in which you do that is through tapping into, through APIs. For example, the Google autocomplete API is pretty popular, and autocomplete is the context that we're going to look at within the search setting. Of course, as Leon mentioned, it's really hard to pin down the causal effect of access to data. Just because there's a lot of self-selection of users, of companies, etc. And so that's why we are going to sort of run a field experiment. But of course, this is not only a managerial issue. This is a DMA and beyond conference. And in part, we started working on this project like 4 or 5 years ago, and I wasn't even aware of this sort of this sort of proposition that was going to come up in the DMA. But it sort of speaks in spirit, definitely, to the obligations on gatekeepers within the search market, which is to provide any third-party data providers of online search engines with access to ranking, query, click, and view data generated by end users. We're going to focus on only one part of this, just because the drawback of running a field experiment is that it's often partial equilibrium. You can only focus on one bit. So ours is going to be in the ranking/query stage. But of course, the DMA guidelines are being echoed, elsewhere in the world. We were also motivated by the fact that there are data sharing sort of provisions coming forward in China, which is where our partner is. So just to give you a quick overview, the question that we're trying to answer is, what's the causal impact of access to the market leader's data? So market leader or gatekeeper, we use them, those terms interchangeably, on the focal company's product performance. And the focal company, which is our partner company, is this sort of new startup search engine within a larger technology company in China. What we find is that removing access to this external data reduces click-through rates on these autocomplete suggestions by 4.6%. We can also measure downstream impact on click-through rates on the search engine results page, so the main search engine results page, and we have an elasticity of ranging from 0.12 to 0.18, which means that a 10% increase in click-throughs on the autocomplete leads to a 1.2 to 1.8% increase in the top slot clicks of the SERP. What type of queries are impacted by this? The data sharing through the API is happening in a de-identified way, in a privacy-preserving way, which, of course, which is another goal that we strive towards, but it also means that the smaller player doesn't get access as much to the long tail query information, right? So we find that popular content is only affected, or the results of popular categories are affected. There's an additional sort of trade-off here, which is the following. Our experiment is run for 3.5 months, and which is much longer than a typical experiment within a tech setting. A week, 2 weeks is long within a tech setting. So what we see is that the average effect, so the negative effect of removing access to the API, actually reduces over time. So the effect gets less negative. And we try to dig into why that's happening, and we posit the role of learning from internal data as the key mechanism. So when this paper got accepted at Management Science a couple of months ago. But in that we spent a lot of time trying to tease out this mechanism. So I hope to shed some light. Okay, so going into the details, as I mentioned, our partner company is actually it's a group within a larger company. So think of it as a startup that has a search product, a general search product within this sort of super app ecosystem that we often see in China. So there's, the super app has news feeds, videos, ebooks, etc. This new team doesn't have access to the same sort of resources as the company at large. So that's why the framing is in terms of gatekeeper versus a smaller player. What is the context? Of course, we did not partner with Google. I should have maybe removed that. But just for the sake of translation, we're looking at autocomplete, right? Initially, I didn't know whether this was an economically relevant thing, but you realize the amount of resources all these companies spend in trying to get this right. And then over the past couple of years, we've had several autocomplete type of papers come out, including one by Chiara, which sort of validates the fact that this seems relevant going in. But more conceptually, this is an application of early generative AI models. So, ChatGPT is the autocomplete of everything. This is just simple autocomplete, but the idea is similar. The idea is also to make sure that they're able to match your preferences right up front. Players have started realizing this, and search engines are starting to monetize placements on these autocomplete suggestions themselves. That's happening at scale in China, and Chinese tech companies are often half a step ahead. And of course, it's going to come to the US for sure. Our key outcome variable of interest is click-through rates, and then we look at downstream outcomes. So the top slot clicks. Just as an example, this is what the Google autocomplete API looks like. So it's available in the market, and lots of people tap into it. So what is the experiment? We have a between subject design, 3.5-month-long experiment. There are 1 million people in the control group, 1 million people in the treatment group. And external data could come at very different stages of this funnel. But this external API is coming in at the ranking stage. At the initial stages, where you have like billions of, millions and billions of data points, where it's all items and candidate generation, it's a lot of raw data, text data, video data that's being streamlined. There's no personalization there. Personalization only happens at the ranking stage. So what's the experiment? In the control group, the status quo is that you have access to the market leader's API, which means that you have about 100 candidates coming from your own data, and then about 10 or 15 coming from the market leader's data. In the treatment group, the treatment is the removal to the access, to the API access, which means that all the candidates, the 100 candidates, are coming from your own data pipeline. And then eventually you get these suggestions towards the end, and we want to look at click-through rates there, as well as downstream on the SERP, the search engine results page. How am I doing on time? Oh, good. So baseline results. So these are, at the user level, average results. What we find is that removing access to external data leads to a decline in click-through rates in the treatment group by about 4.5% to 5%. We carry out, again, we can't disclose base rates just because it's internal data that's proprietary information. So everything is in terms of lift, which is a standard measure or a standard way of representing stuff. We carry out a bunch of back-of-the-envelope stuff in the paper, and it suggests that it's economically meaningful in the sense that if you're a small player, just getting access to this information at the ranking stage is meaningful. Now, does this mean that it closes the gap? If you're Google versus Bing, you're at 10% versus 90%. How much does it close the gap? Not as much, right? But just in isolation, it can be useful. In terms of the type of content, we find that API removal leads to a decline in click-through rates on popular content only. And this is a reasonably robust result across different types of definitions. But again, the idea is the following, that if you want data sharing to happen, but you want to maintain privacy, it has to be depersonalized, right? So when these API queries are happening, it does not take into account your location, your device type, or anything else. So all the information is coming from basically the market leader having access to lots of data with less noise that it can provide to you. But more personalized stuff or more long tail stuff doesn't get impacted. Actually, I think long tail suffers. It's a null result, so it's, you know, the long tail is not affected, not that it suffers. So that's a typo. Okay. We, you know, in our context, we care about clicks on the autocomplete suggestions themselves because they make money for you know, for the company that displays you know, that displays those autocomplete results, because there is some sort of revenue sharing agreement. But absent that, what happens, you know, let's say at the in the downstream, right? Maybe you're not monetizing clicks on these autocomplete suggestions, but maybe it's streamlining search downstream. And so, you know, if I start writing something about Pittsburgh, you know, Pittsburgh restaurants, there's a list. Generally, a search engine, you know, makes a reasonable amount of money from these top slot clicks, right? They're often sponsored, amongst other things. In any case, it might streamline the search process. What do we find here? You know, we basically use a two-stage least square, simple sort of analysis, which is to use the random variation generated by the experiment as the first stage, right? That shifts what people click on in the search suggestion stage, and that has downstream effects. And what we find is that you know, a 10% decrease in click-through rates on search suggestions, you know, in the beginning leads to you know, a 1.2 to 1.8% decline in top slot queries, query click rates. Just to give you a sense, again, you know, I referenced Chiara's paper earlier. There's also, you know, nice work by Gord Birch and Jack Tong. These sort of estimates are in the same sort of ballpark, right? So, and I'm going to talk about, you know, data effects in general towards the end, and I'm going to put some of these estimates more in context. But in general, what we're finding is that impact of recommender systems, you know, we were talking about algorithmic change, I think, as well during lunchtime. It's like, you know, ranges from 2 to 3, you know, 2 to 3% on average. For some kinds of people, it might, you know, go up to 8 or 10%. But those are, I think, in terms of engagement, those are the ballpark numbers that I've seen. Okay. I'm going to spend, you know, a reasonable chunk of time now on these sort of longer term results, because one of the strengths, I think, of this experimental setup is that we were able to run this experiment for 3.5 months. What we find is the following, that when you remove access to external data, the immediate impact is pretty large. So, you know, it can go up to about -9%, right? So that's meaningful just on its own. But, you know, if we had let this experiment run for only 2 or 3 weeks, that's what we would have taken away. On average, it's a 9% change, which is still a big amount. But if you let it run for longer, as we did, it sort of stabilizes at like a -3%, right? Or -4%. And those numbers are very different, right? And so I think it's important to, you know, when we take a broader look at any of these experiments or analyses, we look at longer term adjustments, you know, that's whether that's on the user side or whether that's on the algorithmic side, because we need algorithms to learn, and updating of algorithms doesn't happen every few days, right? These are big systems that need to be trained and retrained, often offline. We posit the role of improved prediction due to internal data. Why is this becoming less negative over time? And the flip side of this is the following, that over time, the use of the search button where you bypass any of the autocomplete suggestions is reducing over time. So initially, when you think that the performance of the product is really bad, you use that search button on the right to bypass any of the search suggestions that you get. But that reduces over time. So it's sort of the mirror image. What we do, we spend a lot of time to rule out certain alternative explanations. We don't find any differential attrition across groups. We find lack of diminishing returns. So it's pretty linear. So in contrast to what Leon found, we can rule out certain behavioral explanations, which is people just being dissatisfied with the product that they've been using, because we find it across new and old users. What we posit is the following, that when you remove access to external data through this API, the algorithm gets more internal data, which feeds back into its system, and it's learning through it. And over the past few years, like 5, 6, 7 years that I've been working on now these recommender systems, it's like I've learned a lot from some of my CS colleagues, because some of it gets pretty technical. So I'm going to sort of break it down in two parts. If you could learn through an API output, then we would actually find that that longer term effects will become more negative. But it's extremely hard to incorporate API output back into the training system. John Lawler has this nice paper, which is that sparsity associated with the output coming from an API is very hard to feed back into the system. Basically, because you don't observe anything in that funnel that I showed. You only observe the final suggestion. And even if you were allowed to incorporate this data into training, most legal agreements prohibit you from doing that. So this is just OpenAI's legal agreement, which is that you cannot use the API output to train a competing model, or to train or develop a competing product, right? So legally, you're not supposed to do that. And even if you could, technically, it's very hard. We find that the suggestions that are made across the treatment and control group over time become different in our data, which means that there might be some differential learning. So the overlap ratio here is the proportion of search suggestions or autocomplete suggestions that were the same across the treatment and control group. And this is declining over time. This is, again, just suggestive. But of course, we also find an increase in click-through rates. Finally, we get more data, which is at the user query day level, to find within and across user learning, which is that repeated queries by the same user or repeated queries across different users leads to a dampened treatment effect. Remember that the treatment is the removal of access to the API. And this treatment effect is less negative if when it's repeated queries or there is some history of the same queries across users, which with this we take to be the strongest sort of evidence in favor of learning by the algorithmic systems. But again, this is using experimental variation, but it's also using some observational bits. So this is less causal. This is more suggestive. But I think there's a lot more in the paper. We have a second experiment to validate some of these results. But since I have a few minutes, I'm going to quickly give you an overview of what I spoke about, and then I'm going to try and give you a broader view of data effects in search markets, based on what I know, as well as the value of data more generally. Because I think as I was listening and thinking through these conversations, some of it also applies to the DSA type of conversations that we've had. So what we find is that on average, external data seems useful for smaller players, again, on average, but whether it's going to singularly narrow that gap, in a supremely concentrated market, not sure. It can be, one thing, it can be one tool as part of a broader toolkit. But that average effect masks heterogeneity, which I think companies as well as regulators could be mindful of, which is that you need to sort of solve this problem of API output being potentially incorporated in that feedback loop. Because based on these results, it seems as if this learning matters, and it's hard to incorporate that information from API out. Where does this sort of put us overall? Referencing the first session of the morning, like there is some self-preferencing here because I've put one of my papers, even though it's not in the search context, but something to keep in mind is that the sort of algorithmic architecture remains very, very similar across these different areas. So, whether it's search, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's, delivery platforms, it's the basic funnel that I showed remains pretty similar. So, and with some of these papers coming together, you have to dig into the nuances to make sense of them together. For example, Leslie Chu and Catherine Tucker, I don't think that paper is published. Like I thought it's a really nice paper 10 years ago where they use like a natural experiment to find that data retention, regulations don't have any impact on search results or the efficacy of search results. But this paper by Schaefer and Seppi seems to find some within user and across user learning. This was in part, this project that I worked on was in part motivated by my previous paper with Chris Poikert and York Clausen, where we do find diminishing returns setting in after a while, but we also find some complementarities in learning within and across users. And that's how we were sort of rationalizing the two papers that we saw. That, what Leslie Chu and Catherine Tucker found was that, if you reduce data retention from like 6 months to 3 months, it doesn't seem to matter. But that might be because of diminishing returns, that set in within 3 months for sure. Schaefer and Seppi, they look at a month-long period where they find some spillovers. Again, there are nuances. Happy to discuss them a bit later. Taking half a step back, an additional half a step back. What is exciting for me personally is that there is a lot of work that's happening on the value of data in general, across strategy, information systems, marketing, and economics. And you can think of like these different types of data in 3 sort of different ways. There's, the focal firm's internal data, where, let's say 10 years ago, you're just trying to leverage whatever digital footprints you have on your own platform. Now we're moved to third-party data where there's data sharing, and then there is external public data, right? Where the Obama administration told city councils to make a lot of this data available, which is now being taken down from government websites. But if I think of the Digital Services Act, where you're asking companies to create these repositories, that's in line with like an open data initiative that we would think of mandated by a government. But thank you so much for your attention, and look forward to the chat.
I wasn't sure where we were headed.
All right. Thank you so much. And honestly, kudos to the organizers, because there's a lot of links between these two papers. And so I want to start with that question that is for both of you, in fact, and it's what we have on this slide, the value of data, because you seem to have a bit of a opposite result, right? Ananya shows a positive effect of having access to more data from the market leader. And you, Leon, show kind of a null effect or an epsilon effect, at least relative to what Ananya has showed us, of having data from Google for a company like Microsoft. Can you help us together square these two results?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I can start. I think we have to separate two things, right? One is the effect of having additional data on some measure of quality, say click-through rates, right? And there we find that you would have sort of an additional 1.5 percentage points in click-through rate, which is actually like almost a 10% increase, right, in click-through rate. And I think you find like a 4 or so of a percentage point effect on click-through rate. So that doesn't seem like they're at least not order of magnitude different, right? Yours is a little bit larger, but we have very different data that we're adding into the mix. And then what we find is that the change in click-through rate would not be associated with a major change in market share in our setting. Now, I would be highly interested to know what you think, what sort of change in market share could be expected based on your estimated change in click-through rate.
Right. So full disclosure, at some point we discussed this like a couple of months ago, but I think that the distinction is on two dimensions. One is that what I think is just like economically meaningful for the company itself, right? And the second thing is, how do you close that gap? So for this company or this sort of search startup, it was pretty meaningful, right? But does that mean that they get closer to a Google-like player? Not just by itself. In terms of the numbers themselves, actually they are similar, in the same sort of ballpark, even though, which was the funny bit, right? It's like, using different types of approaches, we were getting to the same place on average. Now, the dynamics, etc., I think are interesting. Sorry, and one thing about your point about the market share, we don't find any effect on the extensive margin, right? But I don't know if we were powered enough to find effects on the extensive margin, because that was not the goal of the company, and that's why I hesitate. I use that as a nice check to validate these intensive margin findings that we have, but I think that would require separate. This was like 1 million people in each arm, so this would you would require much more to actually detect effects properly.
And that's actually a great point just to remind people that also our effects on the extensive margin, as you call it, on market shares, they have a large standard error on them, right? So it's very hard to get market share effects neatly pinned down.
Yeah, that's what I saw, like the confidence band. Yeah.
And so let's stay to those market shares, because those market shares move clearly once you get people to experience another product, but they don't move with the things that we think are relevant for search, right? So these data network effects, these ranking of search results from best to worst. What is going on there?
Yeah, that is something we are puzzling about as well. I think, there is such a thing as a brand effect, as people being used to the interface, maybe the ecosystem is more integrated with what they are using. But I agree with you that it's hard to find the one culprit, shall we say, for Google's large market share. And it's a bit unsatisfying to leave it sort of in the residual term. In an industrial organization, we always have this XI term that sort of captures, like, why is the market share of this firm higher than we would otherwise predict based on observables? And that's kind of what we find here. Now, I think there are loads of things that people could be used to in the interface, or quality of like widgets or various sort of other aspects of the search engine that could explain this. But at the end of the day, I agree with you. We were surprised that we didn't find a stronger quality effect. We have to sort of yield to the data, but with the caveat that there is a large standard error on that effect. And, if regulators can't give us data, maybe they can give us money to run bigger experiments, and then the standard errors will go down.
Thank you. Another couple of, you want, yes, please.
Yeah. One thought, it's puzzled me, because it's like, even with the editor and algorithm paper, we were like, these numbers, they're again meaningful, but they're not, they're not the 20, 30, 40% that we I don't know, hoped or we thought going in. I feel that, maybe it's just a standard, status quo bias sort of story where, you find something that's good enough and that's it. If you're above a certain threshold, that's it. We're talking about AI, right? So it's like everyone's talking about ChatGPT, but there have been other models since ChatGPT that actually perform better. But people are like, I never knew that this technology was this good, and I'm happy. It's like, it's only in my sort of in our sort of tech community where you're like, there's Mistral, there's Perplexity, there's DeepSeek and stuff like that. I don't know how much that shifts these market shares.
Awesome. I have another couple of questions, but please prepare yours as well. So one is these big contrast, Ananya, in your results on long-term versus short-term, because a lot of the research that we have right now, and I think it's fair to say even in Leon's research, those are short-term results, right? Now, your research kind of posits a favorable, right, indication that in the long run, things are going to get fixed, right? Like if you can't use the fancy GPUs, you can still make do and create DeepSeek. If you can't use, the market leader's data, well, you're going to slowly learn with your own data. Is that always a positive view in the longer term, or there's a sense in which it may be worse than the short term, than what we measure in the short term? And I'm going to start with you, Ananya, but Leon, I'd love your thoughts too.
Yeah, I think the caveat is the following. We sort of piggyback on this thing live stream. Yes. Okay. So we piggybacked when they were about to run the experiment, but this was like 6 months into the into the existence of the product. And when you look at the first few weeks or the first month, the effects are pretty large and negative. Like 10%, 9-10% decline in engagement is quite a lot. I don't, based on conversations, what we were told was that the reason why they tapped into this external data initially was just because of sparsity. They did not have enough suggestions to provide people. So ours might be a bit of an underestimate in terms of, how much this data sharing could help, because we're missing that initial 6-month period where there was sparsity. When we look at our data during the experimental period, the average number of search suggestions across the two are almost exactly the same. So they had solved this issue of sparsity, to some extent by the time we ran the experiment. So yes, there is a caveat in our results that, you cannot incorporate API data, and it's very hard, and potentially you can learn, but we did not, see what was happening in the first 6 months. So that's to put it in more context.
So I guess talking about short run versus long run, and in our paper, you really have to separate the two pieces, right? So we run this field experiment, and in the field experiment, the longest sort of, or the most interesting intervention, I guess, is this ranking degradation, and we do it for 2 weeks. And you might think that is not that long. I actually think it's a comparatively long period of time, especially if you've never used that search engine before, right? The trick is really you have no prior or no strong prior, one would hope, on how good that search engine is, and then you experience it for 2 weeks, and you never can find, I don't know, I was dog fooding this when I was inviting some of you for seminars. I'm still latently mad at some of you for not having an academic website that's easily findable. That's just because you were, link number 1, so link number 10. But so I actually think the treatment effect there, it's pretty large. So I'm not so worried about that, even though it is kind of short term. And then the other part is, of course, the part that we did with the observational data. But with the observational data, we are not limited anymore to experimental time horizons, right? So the learning that we estimate in the observational data actually takes place over an entire year. So there I'm much less worried that there would be, say, more learning from the same data if we checked in, if we could somehow check in 10 years later and have not given them access to additional data. I don't think that that's really something we're missing.
Last question. Obviously, Google was found liable to abuse its monopolistic position in the search engine market. Now we are in the phase where we need to decide what to do with it, right? Assuming that the decision stays. How does both of you how does your research inform these debate? What would you recommend doing? And I know you said defaults, but concretely, what does it mean? Defaults. And for you is, well, you had open access to the data of the market leader, but it's not always guaranteed. So how do we think about this?
So maybe I should go first on this one, because if you think back to my counterfactual slide that was carefully designed to sort of try to sell you on a remedy that we sort of didn't ex ante think would be important in this market, but that we now really think would matter. And to be fair, I don't know how easy it is to implement, but a delayed choice screen, I think, would solve both the issue of getting users to experience alternative search engines, right? A delayed choice screen where Google cannot bid on the default position, or shall we say, any market leading entity that's found to be a monopolist cannot bid on the default position. That might be a bit easier to implement in law. And then still after 2 weeks, you have a choice screen like in the European Union, right? That combines these important goals of making sure people get exposure to alternative search engines, but at the same time, still allowing the people who are inattentive, but who strongly, strongly prefer Google to be able to select back into Google when that choice screen pops up. I think that is our sort of number 1 suggestion.
Yeah, I think my only thought is to not take our own results too seriously and just keep going, because I feel that I feel that we need more papers, just in terms of data, like at least the field experiment that I presented is just like one field experiment where you shut off access at one point, and that has a reasonable effect, right? If you think of the intervention, so it's an economically meaningful effect. What's happening, when you get access to raw data, is that possible or not? So I would say that based on Leon's findings and mine, I'd say that clearly it seems as if, what Leon seems to suggest has a larger impact, but I would also not take my own findings too seriously, because I think there's so much which is left unexplored.
Would you coerce Google to share their data?
If there is a privacy preserving way of doing it, because we care about privacy, absolutely yes. But then it's like, for example, there are, I think some company was fined because you had to keep like European Union data in the European Union. Yeah. So
I like asking questions
yeah,
and not answering. All right, other questions?
Hi, is this on? Hi, that's Megan Gray. I had a question, Leon, for your field experiment. How did you prevent external forces, like when a user was in YouTube or in Gmail and getting pop-ups asking them to change the default back to Google search? Was that incorporated as part of your experiment so that users couldn't accidentally have their default changed?
Right. So So for starters, we can't prevent that from happening. However, I don't think that is actually a frequent experience, and we would measure if they're changing. And so what we see is that while we're paying them, they are not changing a whole bunch. Then we have this active choice survey where they make another active choice. There, a bunch of them are changing. And then the market share is relatively stable. There was one point of subtlety that I didn't get to in the talk, which is sort of a week or 2 weeks after that survey. We were so surprised by the results. We actually basically sent another email and we were like, are you sure? Like, do you want to stick with this? And so there you see another tiny drop off. That's why you see a little bit of dynamics in the orange line after the 14-day period, but then it's basically flat. So that suggests to me that, you know, this could have happened, but it's maybe not happening a lot. And I think possibly that is because like Gmail, for instance, doesn't know what default search engine you actually have set.
Yep, both are fantastic studies. I have a question for both of you. So does your results speak to the incentive of the large platform providing such data? Like to what extent they're willing to, or at what price they're willing to? And if they're not willing to what extent the regulators can twist their arm to provide the data? And should the remedy include kind of friendly and reasonable price for such data sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think right now, these APIs are in the market and these companies do make a reasonable amount of money based on every query, right? We didn't have cost data, but if we use publicly available cost data, it might even be, you know, it might not make economic sense for companies to tap into these APIs. So I think if regulation has to sort of mandate some sort of pricing mechanism in there as well. Otherwise, it might not work.
Yeah, Google definitely does not want to share data according to our estimates, even if it has a small positive impact on Bing's market share. Like, why would you do that, right? But maybe that's an important moment to realize something I didn't emphasize previously, which is, of course, Google sharing data does raise consumer surplus in our model. It's a very small amount because it doesn't really matter, but like the direction is signed as well, right? So if you're worried that, you know, maybe we are underestimating it or something, like it's still a robust finding to say maybe you should share.
Thank you for two great presentations. To what extent have you shared your findings, Leon, with the Commission? The delayed choice screen in particular is very interesting.
Gotcha. I have not talked to the Commission personally, but I think one of my co-authors gave a presentation there recently, or is just gearing up to give a presentation, Matt Ganskow. Yeah.
Just a quick to follow up on that. Your findings focus on two big dominant US corporations, but there's also an overarching interest in the EU to improve the competitiveness of EU companies. So to what extent are you looking at what the implications for EU companies could be and how this could, you know, be extended beyond just like existing dominant players?
Right, so I think from my perspective, there's sort of 2 or 3 things here. The first one is it's incredibly expensive to run experiments when you have to recruit people who are rare. And users of any search engine other than Google or Bing are extremely, extremely rare. So without like 10 or 20xing my research funding, I think it's impossible to like literally run an experiment targeting them. However, you know, some of our results you can extrapolate. So one thing that we find about the diminishing returns to data, right, we find there is not a huge effect if Google shared the data with Bing. However, that's because Bing is already quite large. So if you share data with a much smaller search engine, that data is going to be way more valuable to them because of the diminishing returns. So in that sense, maybe data sharing becomes a more robust recommendation if you're thinking about smaller players in the market. And the other thing is, sorry, just to follow up, I believe that most European search companies actually source their index from Bing. So anything that helps Bing will help them.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the only thing that I wanted to say, is that even like players like DuckDuckGo, Yahoo, etc., you know, the core backend is coming from Bing. So just looking at tools is pretty good. We're done.
Okay. Thank you guys. Have a good break.